1927 is often remembered as the first year of sound in cinema, with the release of The Jazz Singer, which featured some scenes of synchronized audio.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet.
However, 1927 also marks one of the most experimental and exciting years of the silent era, with films like Metropolis, Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, and October. I was particularly keen to have a look at the silent era to see what kind of editing might be possible without the necessity of syncing sound. In other words, how do editors in the silent era communicate story to their audience? The most ambitious film of 1927 has to be Abel Gance's Napoleon, a 5.5-hour silent biopic about the self-proclaimed Emperor of France. Gance himself is underrepresented in the history of cinema, but is responsible for many important innovations, particularly in editing. Cited as an inspiration to Soviet filmmakers such as Eisenstein, Podovkin, and Kuleshov, the French director is as much a theorist as he is a filmmaker. He argues cinema's greatest strength lies in editing, saying, "The value of cinema is to be found not in the photography on the surface of images, but in the rhythm between the images and the idea behind the image." Further, he adds, "What one sees is of secondary importance. It's what one feels that counts." This is particularly apparent in the sequence I have chosen from Napoleon, where the titular character finds himself in the midst of a terrible storm while the National Convention is congregating in Paris. I want to analyze this remarkable sequence through two techniques, rhythm and superimposition. Rhythm. Karen Perlman notes the way rhythm is often talked about as the driving force of the editing process, but one that academics have failed to properly define. Her book, Cutting Rhythms, argues that editors use their experience of natural, real-life rhythms to inform their editing process, which is then transmitted to an audience by kinesthetic empathy. Kinesthetic empathy refers to the way an audience feels the film in their own bodies, the actions of the characters, their emotional expressions, and most importantly, the rhythms of the cut. In the sequence from Napoleon, for example, the cutting rhythms allow an audience to experience the movements of the ocean. Gance evokes the rhythms of a tempest, its violent chops, swells, whirlpools, and dislocations. For example, here we can see Gance capturing the choppiness of the ocean by a quick haphazard cutting. But here he evokes the swell of large waves in a storm. Gance saw rhythm as being the principal element of cinema. He says, the possibility of inventing new rhythms, of encapsulating the rhythms of life, of intensifying them and varying them infinitely, becomes the essential problem for cinematographic techniques. Gance sometimes referred to cinema as the music of light. If cinema is analogous to music, then rhythm represents variation in the horizontal plane. Beats, ostinatos, syncopation, and so on. But what about the vertical plane? That is, things related to sound texture, such as pitch, timbre, and harmony. How would we apply these terms to editing? This brings us to the other important technique used in the Napoleon sequence, superimposition. Superimposition is the layering of images on top of one another. It's not used very often in contemporary cinema, but can be quite a beautiful effect. If cutting represents the rhythmic component of editing, superimposition might be said to represent harmony. In music, harmony occurs when two notes are played at the same time, such as a perfect fifth. Here we can see the two waves of a root note and a fifth note, seen in red and blue in the diagram. When they are played together, they superimpose to create a third wave, what we call the perfect fifth harmony. This is the green wave in the diagram. Superimposition in cinema is no different. It allows editors to reveal resonances and dissonances between two images while also creating a third abstract space. In the Napoleon sequence, I love that Gance is superimposing literal waves on top of one another, just in the same way that harmony is created by superimposing sound waves on top of one another. Gance's use of superimposition resembles water itself, blending and liquefying the images into one swirling mass of particles. Boats, guillotines, and eagles all float around in this chaotic soup. So how do rhythm and superimposition drive the story? I suggest in two ways: kinesthetic empathy and simile. Kinesthetic empathy. The very texture of the editing works to ground us in the story by assimilating our experiences with that of the characters. Gance's cutting rhythms communicate the feelings of chaos and disorientation that the characters are experiencing. This is also true of his use of superimposition, which causes the image to resemble the ocean itself. The viewer is thrown into the same tumultuous mess as the characters. Simile. Rhythm and superimposition also create a cinematic simile between the political storm occurring in the convention and the actual storm occurring in the ocean. When thinking of how to shoot this scene, Gance was inspired by this quote from Victor Hugo. "To be a member of the convention was to be a wave of the ocean. It beat down one and raised up another. It scattered this man into foam and dashed that one upon the rocks." Translating this literary simile to the screen, Gance uses superimposition to create a cinematic simile, comparing the storm to the convention. For example, this frame-accurate superimposition matches the crowd to the ocean almost perfectly, making them analogous to each other. Thus, when Napoleon is seen to master the waves, we understand that he will come to unify the chaos of the National Convention as he crowd surfs his way towards his rise as emperor. So how will this scene inform my editing practice? Studying this sequence, more than anything else, has made me consider the similarities between music and film. How can musical terms like rhythm and harmony inform the editing process? Rhythm. Rhythm might be the best explanation for when a cut feels wrong, without being able to cite a tangible reason. As such, I endeavor to pay much more attention to the rhythms of my cuts. Karen Perlman notes the way editors often physically embody the characters on screen as they edit, mouthing their dialogue and mimicking their gestures. With this in mind, I am thinking of making my editing practice much more physical, speaking along with the characters, copying their actions, in other words, singing and dancing along to the cut to make sure the rhythm works. Harmony. Harmony, or superimposition as it manifests itself in cinema, is a harder one to integrate, as not every sequence requires superimposition in the same way as rhythm. That being said, I will be on the lookout for instances where it works for the story, as I feel it is an underutilized and beautiful effect. I will also consider holding crossfades for longer to create visual resonances between two places, characters, images, and so on. Walter Murch, in his book In the Blink of an Eye, lists emotion as the most important factor in his editing decisions, claiming he cuts for emotion 51% of the time. Questionable mathematics aside, it is clear that in the sequence from Napoleon, emotion is Gance's principal reason to cut. Our sense of space is completely disorientated, we don't really know who anyone is, and yet through Gance's understanding of cinematic rhythm and harmony, the sequence speaks to us on a purely emotional level, much like music. Gance was always looking to expand the ways in which cinema could communicate to audiences. Nowhere is this more clear than in the final sequence of Napoleon, where he edits 3 shots side by side to each other. By thinking of cinema as the music of light, as Gance did, we can also begin to explore new ways of engaging audiences emotionally. For an editor, this means opening up to the rhythms and harmonies of everyday life and finding intuitive ways to convey them on screen.